Okay, we are live. It's happening. Listen, welcome, Rob. Thank you so much for being here. Hey, folks, it's Simon Rosenberg, Hopium Chronicles. Welcome, everyone. And we're back with we're just getting into this live technology, and I've asked Rob Shapiro, our dear friend, to come back and give us an update on the Trump economy, the economy that I'm now calling the pay more, get less Trump economy, which, or you can call it $2 or 5 pencils or whatever your preference is. But Rob has just written, Rob's a leading economist in the Democratic or the center left, senior advisor to the Clinton campaign in 1992, undersecretary of commerce, has been around the block and writing and working on these issues for a few years. We've been many years collaborating. And Rob has just written a terrific piece in Washington Monthly about what could happen with the economy. And so, Rob, welcome. Thanks for being with us again.
It's always a pleasure, Simon.
Well, here we go. Why don't you just walk us through your article? I mean, this is something that you and I talk frequently, and this is an article that we've been talking about for a few weeks. You put a lot of work into this one, like you do all your work, because you're a thorough economist and nerd, and so it's important that you get it right. But this was a little bit of a big swing because you tried to sort of explain a series of different things that could happen and how it all adds up. And so
Right.
give us a sense of what you wrote in Washington Monthly this week.
Sure. Um, I think of it as a perfect storm. In the book and the film and now in real life, a perfect storm is that rare combination when destructive forces come together in a way that magnifies the damage of each force. And that's what's happening today. Um, I didn't write about the tariffs for a while because everybody was writing about them. And I wanted to wait until I had something new to contribute. Everybody knows that tariffs raise prices because they do so directly. Trade is our imports are, we're talking about 14% of the economy. And it's mainly most of the things we import, more than 50% are inputs for things that US manufacturers are making. And so this is not simply about raising the price of dollars and pencils. It's about raising the price of everything with steel and aluminum and most things with electronics, as well as raising the price of vegetables and fruit, automobiles, and so on. Now, the second order effect of that is that if you're paying more for all of these goods that are either imported or depend on inputs from other countries, then you have less money left to spend on everything else. And that means the economy slows. The demand the for everything except necessities that include imports or imported parts has to go down because your incomes haven't gone up as prices have gone up. And so that's why economists are talking about a recession. And tied to that, of course, is the retaliatory tariffs from other countries. The most notable example, of course, is China. And our tariffs are so high on China, and China's retaliatory tariffs are so high, that what we really have is a mutual embargo by the world's two largest and most important economies. And that means not only that um, every other economy is going to be affected, which means that demand for our exports will be dampened. Um, it also means that we're going to face serious shortages. shortages of the sort that our grandparents saw in World War II. And, those shortages were necessary in order to channel all production into war equipment. Um, these shortages are totally discretionary. We're choosing that. That is, Trump has chosen them. And it gets worse because when we have fewer products coming in from abroad and consequently being sold, and fewer products being sold in other areas because people's incomes haven't gone up as the prices have gone up, that also affects jobs and demand for everything that surrounds a product. So, for example, the money that American companies pay to market products, they're going to spend less because they'll be selling less. Their accounting and legal services, the transportation of these products, and ultimately the retail sales of these products. So it's not just the manufacturers. It's very large sector of the economy will see contraction because they're the services associated with all of these products. Um, and if they, and this means you have these multiple forces dampening demand, driving down demand as they're driving up prices. And if this remains in effect for, say, 6 months, I think we are then looking at a recession on the level of 2008, 2009. That is a very deep recession, not one that is simply tied to higher prices for imports, but tied to all of the ripple effects that go throughout the economy. And then there's the problem of um, the bond and stock markets. Investors have voted very clearly thumbs down on this whole regime. And the reason is in part because they know the U.S. economy is going to slow a lot, but it's also because investors are losing confidence in Trump and his management of the economy. And so there's this enormous uncertainty. And what happens when you're uncertain is you hold back. Now, U.S. investors don't have many choices. They're locked into their stocks and bonds. They can sell some, but most of them will try to wait it out. That's not true for foreign investors. Foreign investors have lots of alternatives. And this is both investments by foreign governments, by foreign companies, by foreign funds. Um, it's not widely known, but foreign investors today hold 30% of all stock in the United States. They hold 30% of all bonds in the United States. And the reason they did was they trusted the United States to run a credible economic policy, and because the United States was stronger economically than other countries, because it was more stable than other countries. This whole tariff regime has devalued all of that. And so foreign investors are beginning to hold back. Now, in particular for bonds, we have to float government bonds. Today we've already planned almost $2 trillion in new bonds will be floated. Well, if foreign investors are holding back and some U.S. investors are holding back, the only way to float U.S. debt is to raise the return. The return has to go up because the risk has gone up. And that means higher interest rates. So you already had a problem with the recession, the coming recession, for the Fed, because normally when the economy declines, the Fed cuts interest rates. But you can't do that when prices are rising. And in particular, you can't do that if you have to offer a higher return, which is to say a higher interest rate on the new debt that the US government will float this year. It started at, the base was $1.8 trillion in new bonds this year. And then we've got Trump's budget, which will drain $5 trillion in new revenues over 10 years for another round of his tax cuts, uh, up to $4 trillion in lost revenues from his other tax promises, on tips, on Social Security income. And then he wants to add 1.5 trillion over 10 years in defense spending. So you have this rising supply of bonds that you got to sell, a declining demand, the only way to keep the demand up, which is to say to maintain the credit of the United States, is to raise interest rates. And that means that makes the recession even deeper. And when I say recession, what I'm talking about is by the end of the year, unemployment over 5% and moving up, along with inflation at probably 4 to 5%. Um, and finally, there's another feature that to this perfect storm that could really drive the economy onto the rocks. Um, Apart from the tariffs and the capriciousness of U.S. policy in this period, Trump's attacks on the rule of law also threatened the willingness of foreign investors to continue to hold and to buy American bonds and stocks. They see Trump and his administration unilaterally abrogating contracts. We said you'd get this grant. We had a contract. Nope, you're not going to get this grant. Withholding appropriated funds, dismissing court decisions, attacking judges for enforcing their rulings, deporting people without charges or hearings, providing special treatment to large contributors and favored companies, and threatening law firms and universities without legal basis. This has enormous significance for foreign investors because this tells them that the U.S. government may abrogate its contracts with the foreign investors, and every bond you buy is a contract. Or decide not to enforce a foreign investor's agreements with U.S. companies when it serves the political or personal interests of the president. That's the way the world works in kleptocratic dictatorships, in Russia, in Venezuela, and nobody buys their stocks and bonds. By following by this convergence of all of these policies, we could be setting off a devastating capital flight that would leave a lot of our leading financial institutions insolvent. After all, where is their capital? It's all in stocks and bonds. So this will turn this if this persists, it will turn this period from a kind of rocky business cycle into a potential financial and economic meltdown. I'm not predicting it. I'm saying that's the risk. And there is a substantial risk of this at this time. There's still time for Trump to abandon his policies. Um, Although I can't see him abandoning his attacks on the rule of law. He just said he doesn't know whether he's bound to enforce the Constitution. But and I'd be very surprised if he abandons his tariff policies. Perhaps as the damage gets increasingly large and you hear protests from Republican office holders, he may be induced to move. But that's a political development, and you're better than I am at that. So.
Well, let me drill down on a couple things. And Rob, thank you for that comprehensive and thoughtful and meticulous description of what could happen, not what will happen, but what is a possibility, but not a not a 0% possibility.
Oh, I think,
And
yeah,
it's
I think a deep recession is a good 30 to 40% probability, and a financial meltdown is probably a 10 to 20% meltdown probability.
well, and I think a couple things. So one is that one of the things that is remarkable to me listening to all of this and what's relevant to what people have said today. So what do we do, right? I mean, what do we do about this? Number one is that we have to continue to put the pressure on all of our elected officials to pressure Trump to roll back the tariffs. We have 13 states that have filed lawsuits that have, given the fact that we've been winning virtually every lawsuit we've been filing against Trump because he's operating outside the constitutional order. We have a high likelihood, I think, in winning in some of these tariff lawsuits that are in place. There's two different lawsuits, one from California, another 12 states have come together to challenge the tariffs. But the second thing is the reconciliation bill that's been passed. The budget outline has been passed in the House and the Senate. Think of it as a budget bill. Right, reconciliation is kind of a funny term. But what's important about that bill, as Rob mentioned, is that here we have interest rates going up. Right, America is a safe haven is under threat. It means that if we have to float lots more debt and a lot more bonds, that's going to be very expensive, right? So what you would not do in that case was do something that would purposefully dramatically increase the deficit and our collective debt, which is actually what their plan is to do, is to take further resources away from the United States government and giving it to wealthy people and a little some crumbs for everybody else. Weakening healthcare in the United States, so Trump gets a huge tax cut. Almost 100 million people have their health insurance and their healthcare damaged. But it's the debt, the size of the debt, the magnitude of the fiscal irresponsibility, which also, by the way, belies this whole idea that what Doge was about was saving people money, when in fact that we now are witnessing sort of the biggest explosion of the deficit that you could possibly imagine, given their economic plans. And it's the exact wrong thing to do at this moment. And it's one of the reasons that I think as we get deeper into this reconciliation discussion, what is happening with tariffs makes this bill reckless and irresponsible to pass. And I think that in addition to it being plutocratic and damaging healthcare, the fiscal part of it, by radically increasing the deficit in a time when interest rates are going up, safe haven is under threat, this will make us look like a banana republic. And you used a different term for banana republic than I'm using, but I mean this budget you use kleptocracy, right? Like Russia and Venezuela. Well, we can be both a kleptocracy and a banana republic, right? We can now achieve both of those statuses, get those badges, right, from the world financial community. And that's the thing that I think as we go into this reconciliation fight, I think we have a very big argument to make about how fundamentally reckless and dangerous it is, given what Trump's initial economic policies have already achieved. And that's where I think we have to tie the reconciliation bill and its recklessness to the recklessness of the tariffs, in addition to the recklessness of him, starting to obliterate the air traffic control system in the United States, and all this other stuff that looks like, you gotta be kidding me. The stuff that he's doing that is like, what are you doing, you crazy dude, right? And the reconciliation bill starts to look as crazy and reckless and dangerous as the tariffs. And I just wondered if you could comment on that a little bit.
Sure. I think that one of the reasons that they've been pushing the reconciliation bill is that they believed that the stimulus from exploding the deficit would offset the dampening forces on growth from the tariffs. And under normal conditions, they might have been right. It actually, it worked for Reagan in 83 and 84. Um, but not under these conditions because of the inflation and because of the pullback in foreign investors, which is incidentally why the dollar is weakened so much. Um, because they don't need dollars to buy US stocks and bonds, because they're not buying them. Um, this is forcing us already to raise interest rates, and the reconciliation bill will double that dynamic. And so the higher interest rates needed to um, maintain US credit in the face of these enormous deficit financings offsets the normal stimulus from a big deficit. But I think that's kind of how they have it in their heads, unless they simply don't have anything in their heads except to follow whatever Trump says.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that I'm working on in my head and in the politics, as you talk about, is that, the reconciliation bill is like pouring gasoline on a fire, right?
Mhm.
And it's going to make
Yeah.
things far worse. And I think we have a lot of running room here to define it that way. I think our early area of engagement on it has been these plutocratic tax cuts and the attack on Medicaid. But I think there's this other way that we can go into this that I think will be very, very effective. In part, also, by the way, the voters that care about, the deficit is still a major voting issue for people. And the people that tend to care about the deficit tend to be the center right country club Republican voters, who are the non MAGA Republicans, that are the ones that are already sort of weakening their support for Trump anyway. And that become those critical voters for us in the purple states and the red states, that if we're going to win these Senate races and these House races that we didn't win last time, right, we don't have incumbents,
Mhm.
those are the voters, the ones that are deficit. They're focused on, they understand that tariffs are bad. They know that deficits are bad. What they're going to do fiscally is bad. They don't like what he's doing on Russia. And that, these kind of more country club, center right Republican, very traditional kind of old fashioned Republicans, the non MAGA Republicans, they're going to hate the fact that Donald Trump is proposing one of the largest increases in the deficit in American history. And that would also be at this moment economically damaging, right? Doubly so. And so I think this is an area of enormous opportunity for us as we try to expand and shrink his coalition and grow our coalition. These are things where we can reach out to voters that we need to. And one other thing, Rob, that I just wanted to get your thoughts on, and just as I try to make sense of the politics of everything that you're saying, is the way that you said something that was, I wrote about it yesterday and it was very interesting to me, is that, talk a little bit more about the attack on rule of law and how that manifests traditionally in global markets, and in global markets, and why this matters more perhaps than in much of the economic conversation that's taken place. It's really been about the tariffs, right? We've
Right.
had a little bit of concern because of the growing deficit and his uncertainty of America, but you point out there's this other catalytic force now that is
Yeah.
weakening the desire of foreign investors to come in or to pull their stuff out of the
Right.
US. Can you just talk a little bit more about that? Because that's kind of a new
Yeah.
angle that you've pushed today.
Yes. Well, this is um, well established in development economics, which looks at where companies, what countries companies invest in. Where do they build their factories? Where do they build their offices? And the conventional view had been, well, they do it where the cost of labor is low and the taxes are low, and um, but it turns out that when you do what's called econometric analysis of this, um, those factors count, but they don't count as much as does that country enforce contracts? Does that Is that country politically and economically stable? That you know every foreign investor who invests in the United States depends on when they have a contract with a supplier or they have a contract with a dealership for a car manufacturer, um, that the contract will be enforced. And because all of their expectations about how much money they're going to make off their investment here or U.S. companies' investments in other countries absolutely depends on the contracts being enforced, which is to say, the rule of law around contracts. And if you take that away, if you say, well, it's not so sure, then you introduce a risk that says your likely return is going to be a lot lower. And and that's what foreign investors are asking themselves right now. That's why, the so far we've seen this largely from Japan.
Yeah.
Japan has pulled back. Trump thinks he holds a trump card with China. Um, he's crazy. China has the trump card. And the trump card is their enormous holdings of US bonds. They could tank the US economy tomorrow if they chose to. That's why they can say, well, we're happy to talk once you eliminate your tariffs on us, because they know they've got the upper hand. It's not like the United States owns 30% of Chinese bonds or 30% of Chinese stocks. Um, we are the basic stability of our financial system, and consequently the economy depends on the confidence of foreign investors, and their confidence relies in very important part on the rule of law in the United States.
Well, and let me wrap up, Rob, by saying that, one of the what's amazing about listening to you go through this and reading your piece in Washington Monthly, and thank you for being here today, is that this all sounds like sabotage, right? Like it doesn't sound like an economic strategy that any rational or sane
It's
person would
it's not.
pursue. Yeah, he inherited, the American economy was booming when he took over. I mean, we had all those covers of The Economist and other magazines over the summer saying the US is the economic envy of the world, and that, he inherited very low inflation and a incredibly strong economy, and the deficit had come way down. And, we were doing far better than any other developed economy in the world. He inherited one of the best economies that any president's ever inherited in all of our history. And within just a few months,
Yeah.
he's turned it into the shit show that you talked about today. And I think that it is hard. I think one of the things that's going to be very important for us, and particularly because today's Tuesday when we're recording this, the president, or our leader, as I call him, because he isn't acting like a president of a democracy, and so we
Yeah.
shouldn't give him that honorific title. Is that he's acting like a mad king, right? Is that he talked today? He used new language to describe the tariffs today and how he thinks trade works, which were arguably the craziest things that he's ever said about how this actually works or can work. And I've been writing a lot at Hopium in the last week that his interviews with ABC News and NBC, I felt, were escalations of his delusion and decline. That he seemed more out of it. The ABC News interview, he was slurring his words. He looked physically terrible, right, in a way that we hadn't really seen him. He was hunched over. His face was like crazy red. And he looks terrible right now. And he sounds crazier than he sounded a month ago. And what I'm worried about, and what we all have to be worried about, is that it's just not clear that Donald Trump really has any understanding any longer of what's happening around him and what he's doing. And as I said to you before we got on here, it's like he's steering the Titanic towards the iceberg on purpose
Yeah.
now, right? And that he's telling everybody that we're not going towards the iceberg, we're going to home, right? And everyone's like, no, there's a big iceberg there. And he's like, I don't see it, right? Like it's not there and I don't see it, so it can't be there, right? And we're dealing with literally the same kind of capriciousness and destructive policies that led to the American Revolution itself, as this rebellion against a mad king who was doing enormous harm to the people that he governed or reigned over. And I think that this is also going to create, his approval rating is already the worst of any president in the first 100 days in the history of polling since World War II. His weakest ratings are on all these economic measures, inflation and tariffs. So he's also, not only is the economy weak and do we not have great tools to manage the crisis that could come, he is also in a very weakened position to be able to manage it, right? He's politically unbelievably weak right now. And today I posted on Hopium that G. Elliott Morris, the former head of 538, who's staked out is writing wonderfully, by the way. I think he's doing a phenomenal job on Substack called Strength in Numbers. He did an analysis using the Economist YouGov polling, showing that the people who've moved the most against Trump are the lowest political information voters,
Mhm.
the ones that were most critical to his victory, right? Who have abandoned him more than any other group. And so he's already lost enormous ground with his most important voters in many ways, right? Which were the ones that he, was able to gather in to win. And so he's in an unbelievably weakened position. And I think that the combination of what's happening in Newark, New Jersey, and the clear now understanding that, it's getting risky to fly. My wife has flown twice in
Yeah.
the last 2 days, 3 hour delay, 4 hour delay, right? And out of San Diego and out of National Airport, right? Or Dulles yesterday, huge delays. And one was weather related, the other one was not, right? And she even said, like, I'm not going to fly for a while, because we have to see. So the combination of tanking the economy, saying you're going to pay more and get less, his approval ratings already in the crapper, right? He's acting crazy around rule of law issues. There's going to be barren shelves and disruptions in supply chains that are coming within days. You're already starting to see a pretty significant escalation of announcements of price increases by
Mhm.
companies now. And you're really looking at a level of sort of political chaos potentially that we haven't seen in a long time in this country. And he's not equipped to deal with it because he doesn't even understand what's happening around him anymore. And
No.
so, I'll let you have the final word here, but I'm sort of, I will just say, as a political person who's been doing this a long time, I'm a little stunned at what I'm seeing, in terms of just the recklessness of his actual agenda. He's getting feedback that it's failing, which he is doubling down on and ignoring in kind of madness. And it's driving his numbers down in a way that, they just look yesterday or today, it was today, yesterday, today, the single most important recruit they had in the Senate in the whole country was getting Governor Kemp to run in Georgia against John Ossoff. And he announced yesterday that he's not running because he doesn't have faith that he can win an election in these midterms, in these circumstances. And so they're getting in their feedback loop, they're being told by everybody, like, hey, you got to cut it out. Like, this is fucking dangerous and you're going to do a lot of damage to the country. And Trump's like, damn the torpedoes, right? Like, we're going ahead, you get $2 and 5 pencils. And it's like we're witnessing a level of madness that is hard to describe and hard to
Well,
talk about to all of you.
let me
And
note
you wrap
that,
it up. Bring it to a close.
okay, I have 2 points I wanted to make. One is the inability to distinguish fantasy from reality is the primary definition of psychosis. That is the bottom line for all forms of psychosis, which is to say, colloquially, madness. The other is that all of the economic disturbances we're seeing now are based on people's expectations of what's coming. We will now see over the next 2 to 3 months the actual unfolding of the higher prices and the rising unemployment because growth is declining. And so the current political response, we're just in the first stage of it. That political response is based on the expectations of what's going to happen, and then it's going to happen, and it's going to be felt very differently.
Listen, my son, who's 22 years old, he's home. Goes to GW. He was here last night, and we were catching up, and he said, Dad, no one my age can get a job. He's like, no one's even. He's like, people aren't even trying anymore. Like, there's no internships, there's no jobs,
Wow.
because what's happening is the laid off government employees are taking jobs that entry level jobs that kids would have taken, right? And he's like, my generation went through COVID,
Mm.
and now we're going through this, and that because in this city, and we're in a different place than other parts of the country, the savage attack on the federal government has created its own unique dynamic to this region. And he was literally like, he has a summer job, by the way. Like, he has a job,
Mhm.
but he's like, many of my friends are not even looking anymore. And internships are basically evaporated across the whole city, and so it's part of the reason, and I wrote about this today at Hopium, and I'll just end, the biggest declines for Trump. I showed this in the Economist YouGov poll among 18 to 29-year-olds. He's dropped 26 points in job approval. And in since the first week of his being in office, and so young people and Hispanic voters, who were two of the most important swing groups to him, have really turned on him, because I'll end with this, which is that his central offering to people, the people that were late deciding, not low information voters, but low political information, or as GLA Morris calls them, disengaged voters,
Mhm.
is that they saw him as a winner and a guy who could help them make more money in their lives and have
Right.
better lives. He was around wealthy, successful people. And so this is a profound betrayal of the central reason that so many people voted for
Yes.
him. So it's not just bad, right? But it's an actual betrayal of what he told everyone he was going to be. And this is a guy who betrays everybody,
Everybody.
everything all the time, right? And he's a betrayer. It's what his central, skill is in life. And I think that's why I think you're seeing these kinds of enormous shifts with Hispanic and young voters, because they were the ones that kind of bought in more than usual
Mm.
demographically, right? He did better with these groups and independents, right? Disengaged voters. and they're seeing him now being something very different than he advertised, and it's costing him dramatically in his standing with these groups that were so his whole coalition that got him elected is already completely unraveled. And what it means for us is that, look, we're going to have to work very hard together. I'll conclude this by saying we got to do everything we can to roll back the tariffs, whatever the pressure we can put on the system. We got to kill this dangerous and reckless reconciliation bill, plutocratic healthcare gutting, reconciliation bill. And we have to start thinking about how we're going to fix the damage and repair the damage that he's caused and what it means and what we can do without having any power, right? I think one of the things that I was encouraged by is the New England states are now going to be meeting with their Canadian counterparts and their to start talking about how they can jointly navigate trade and immigration and their integrated economies in a time when Trump's trying to pull them apart. That's a good and positive step. I mean, that's a constructive thing. And we're going to have to sort of rethink a lot of this stuff about how we do this to work around our destructive, I call him, our saboteur in chief, not a commander in chief, and because all the damage he's doing. And so, Rob, thank you for your continued good work. I hope people appreciate, sometimes here we talk polling, but sometimes we nerd out on, detailed policy because from understanding, I just want to say this as a way of ending, Rob, is that my view, having worked with Rob and others, is that you can only develop an agenda that's relevant and powerful for the American people if you understand what's going on. And people like Rob has been helping us understand what's going on for decades. And so I'm just grateful for you taking time today, Rob, to be with us and for your continued great work. And I'm sure we'll have you back in a few weeks as the shelves start to empty.
Thank you. And I'm grateful for the work that you and Hopium followers are doing to try to turn this around.
We're trying. We almost had a good vote in the Senate last week, but we
Yep.
just fell one short. That one hurt a little bit, I will
It
tell
did
you.
hurt.
And okay. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, everybody. Take care.